My name is Emma Clark. I am 28 years old, and I live alone in a small apartment by the river. The building is old, the kind where you can hear every footstep, every faucet dripping, every whisper through the thin walls. I used to hate the noise, but after a while it became company. Silence felt heavier than sound. I work at a small bookshop near the train station. My days pass quietly, arranging books, serving tea to customers, listening to the same old clock ticking on the counter. People come and go, pages turn, and nothing ever really changes. At least that's what I thought. 2 months ago, someone moved into the apartment next door. A man. I noticed the sound of heavy boxes one morning and soft piano notes. Later that night, the music was slow, thoughtful, and slightly sad. The kind that lingers in your chest after it stops. I never saw him, but the melody stayed with me. The first time I met him was in the hallway. He was carrying groceries, quiet eyes, gentle hands. He nodded politely, said, "Good evening," and disappeared behind his door. Something about him felt distant, like he was here but not really here. Days passed. Sometimes I heard him playing the piano. Sometimes only silence. Once I thought I heard him talking, low, careful, almost like a prayer. I told myself not to imagine things. People had lives, stories, reasons. I had mine too, even if it felt smaller every day. One morning, I found a small envelope under my door. No name, no address. Inside, a short note written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for the flowers." I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't given anyone flowers. Maybe it was for someone else. Maybe it wasn't. That night, curiosity won. I listened through the wall. No music. No voice. Only the faint sound of rain against the window. The next morning, another envelope appeared. She loved the rain. Who was she? His wife? His mother? A memory, I wanted to ask, but I didn't. I just folded the paper and placed it inside my journal. It felt like holding a secret that wasn't mine, but somehow belonged to me too. A week later, I heard the piano again. The tune was slower, deeper, like someone saying goodbye. I stood by my window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. The music stopped, and I heard a door close. Then silence. For the next few days, there was nothing. No footsteps. No kettle, no sound of life. The space behind the wall felt empty. I told myself not to care, but loneliness has a way of echoing even when you try to ignore it. On Sunday morning, I decided to bake. The smell of bread filled my kitchen, and for a moment, the apartment felt warm again. Then I heard a knock. When I opened the door, he was standing there. The neighbor. He looked tired, but his eyes were kind. He held a small envelope in his hand. "I think this was meant for you," he said softly. Inside the envelope was a pressed lavender flower. I asked, "Who's she?" He smiled faintly. "My sister? She used to grow these. She passed away last year." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. After that, we started talking, little by little. Just small things. Books, rain, music. He told me his name was Daniel. He was a teacher once, but stopped working after his sister's accident. He said he moved here because he needed silence to think. But the silence became too loud. I understood that. Silence can shout louder than words when you're alone long enough. I told him about my life. How I stopped painting after my father left. How I used to think dreams were only for people who weren't afraid. He didn't say much, just listened. Like my words actually mattered. Weeks turned into months. I started looking forward to the small sounds next door. The kettle, the chair, the piano. Life began to feel like a rhythm again. One evening, he invited me in. His apartment was simple. Books, old records, a piano near the window. On the wall was a painting of the sea. She painted that, he said, touching the frame gently. My sister loved the ocean. She said it sounded like forgiveness. I stood there silent. I didn't know forgiveness could have a sound. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the painting, about forgiveness, about how I had carried so much quiet anger at my father for leaving, at myself for never trying to move on. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about letting go of the need to hold pain so tightly. The next morning, I picked up my old paintbrush for the first time in years. The colors felt strange on my fingers, but also familiar, like shaking hands with a friend you thought was gone forever. Daniel noticed. You're painting again, he said. I'm trying, I replied. Don't try. He smiled. Just paint. The trying part always gets in the way. He started playing the piano while I painted. The sound filled both our apartments. And for once, I didn't mind the noise. It felt like we were mending something invisible between us. Two lonely people finding their way back to life. One note and one brushstroke at a time. But life, as always, has its turns. One morning, there was no piano, no footsteps, just silence again. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. Mrs. Turner said he had left early that morning with a suitcase. Didn't say where he was going, she told me. He looked peaceful, though. I went back inside, heart heavy, but strangely calm. On my table, I found an envelope slipped under the door. Keep painting. The world needs your colors. That was the last thing I ever received from him. Days passed, then weeks. I missed the sound of the piano, but I kept painting. My walls filled with colors. Sea blues, soft grays, rain-light yellows. The apartment no longer felt empty. One afternoon, I took my paintings to the Riverside Market. People stopped to look, asked questions, smiled. That night, I stood by the window, the candle flickering beside me. I lit it every evening now, lavender scented, in memory of him. The flame danced gently against the glass, and I whispered, "Thank you for listening." Maybe he could hear me, maybe not. But the truth was simple. I had changed. Not because of him, but because of what his presence reminded me. That healing doesn't always come through noise or grand gestures. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just someone who listens. I no longer feared the thin walls or the sound of footsteps. The noise was life. The silence, too, had its own kind of beauty. I started teaching art classes at the bookstore on weekends. I met new people, told stories, laughed easily. And every time a student hesitated, afraid to make a mistake, I said the same words Daniel once told me. Don't try, just paint. One evening, as I was closing the shop, a man came in. He wore a dark coat, familiar eyes, the faint smell of lavender. My heart stopped for a moment. "Daniel?" I whispered. He smiled, older, calmer. "I heard your paintings are at the gallery now," he said. We talked for a while. He told me he had been traveling, visiting places his sister always wanted to see. "I just came to say," he paused, "you were right about forgiveness. It really does sound like the ocean." I laughed softly. "You taught me that." He smiled. "No, Emma, you found it yourself." That night, I walked by the river alone. The city lights shimmered on the water. The world felt big again, but not frightening. I thought of all the things I once feared losing. People, dreams, feelings, and realized they were never really gone. They just changed shape like water, finding new paths. I used to believe life was about holding on. Now I know it's about learning when to let go. Sometimes I still hear faint piano notes in my dreams, soft, steady, like footsteps returning home. When I wake up, I open the window and let the morning air in. The river smells of rain, the sky smells of lavender, and the world feels alive again. And I think of Daniel, of his quiet words, of how two strangers helped each other find the courage to begin again. We don't always need someone to save us. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us that we were never broken, only waiting to be found. When we open our hearts, even a whisper can become music. Have you ever met someone who helped you rediscover yourself, quietly, without even realizing it? Share your story in the comments below.